Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Moments ago, we just had a wonderful conversation on innovation in the creative writing classroom with the winners of the 2024 Bechtel Prize. We wanted to record this conversation to share with you in the magazine, but in a classic Zoom faux pas, I failed to press record until after it had begun. So I would like to still share with you the introduction that was shared in the conversation that we had. And then once my introduction is over, the original recording will begin as Abriana Jetté, the winner of the 2024 Bechtel Prize, begins sharing about her essay. So welcome and thank you for joining us for a discussion on innovation in the creative writing classroom. My name is Joshua Garcia, and I am the managing editor of Teachers and Writers magazine, which is a free online resource for teachers of creative writing. Our magazine has been published since 1967 by Teachers and Writers Collaborative, one of the first writers in the schools programs, with a 50-plus year history of delivering programs that increase access to the arts, build community, and amplify youth voices. Every year, Teachers and Writers magazine awards the Bechtel Prize for an essay describing a teaching experience, project, or activity that demonstrates innovation in creative writing instruction. The prize is named for Louise Seaman Bechtel, who was an editor, author, and teacher. In 1919, she became the first person to lead a juvenile book department at an American publishing house. Bechtel helped establish the field of children's literature and was a tireless advocate for the importance of literature in children's lives. The Bechtel Prize honors her legacy. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists who will each read an excerpt from their essays after their introduction. First up, we have Abriana Jetté, who was selected by Garth Greenwell as the first place winner of the 2024 Bechtel Prize for her essay, Flexing Our Rhyming Muscles, Introducing the Ghazal. Abriana was raised in New York and is a poet, essayist, editor, and educator. Her writing has been featured in Best New Poets, Poetry New Zealand, River Teeth, The Moth, Plume, and elsewhere. Abriana teaches various writing courses for Keene University, where she also leads the Common Read program. Of Jetté's essay, Greenwell shared, "This essay brings us excitingly close to particular moments of writing while also immersing us in a sophisticated and appealing philosophy of the creative act. Along with the writer's students, readers are lured from a space of seemingly chaotic play to an intricate and richly embedded in history and in place understanding of the form. The essay beautifully demonstrates a dialectic of freedom and discipline that animates all art." Please join me in welcoming Abriana Jetté as she shares an excerpt from her essay.
Also want to say thank you to Éireann and Reagan because their essays were so beautiful and inspiring, and it's a real honor to be in your company. So thank you. I'm going to just play the proper pronunciation, quote unquote, proper pronunciation of the ghazal, which I think, depending on your accent, you might say differently, but I pulled it up on Google for those who are interested in hearing it. So I'm going to play that right now. Ghazal. So sometimes it rhymes with muscle, and I tried to rhyme in my title. So I begin my essay by explaining that it's the Wednesday after Thanksgiving and that I know I need my students to write poetry. I know they need to write poetry because I've only given them around 10 writing assignments throughout the semester, and they need to complete 15 to 20 pages of poetry by the end of the semester, which is fast approaching. So I talk a little bit about that, and I say that I'm going to give them some guidance, and then I offer some seemingly random, but obviously very playful writing prompts based off of the rhetorical and theoretical conversations that we've had in the 10 past classes. And so I'm going to read you an excerpt today from what happens after I give those prompts and after that scaffolding has already begun. So my students do as told when told to do it. Some eyes become dizzy throughout, rearranging, rethinking, busy with the work of the poet. Some eyes are doubtful. What's the point here? What are we doing? But they do it anyway. When the music of the keyboard commences, they look at me again the same way they did when class began an hour ago. I know what they want, why they're looking. They want to know why they made what they made. But I'm feeling silly. I'm in a really good mood, so I hold off on giving them. Now, remember, I tell them this isn't finished yet. It's not perfect, but it's playful, it's something, and it even has your name in it. Isn't that special? I ask them to turn to the person they're sitting next to and share what they've created. They take a few minutes and they share their work. And what they've created is outlined in the essay. I know that it might seem a little odd if you've not read the essay, but if you read the essay, there's demands, so to speak, of what to do. Afterwards, the poetic urge within them begins to rise. From their conversations, I hear whispers of, are we going to revise this? Can we work on this a little bit more? And does it really have to rhyme? You know, I tell them. Sometimes I stop myself from writing because I only have 20 minutes, or the laundry needs to be done, or I'd rather write an email, or my idea isn't fully developed. Sometimes I give myself any excuse not to write a poem. And they laugh. They think I'm joking and I'm trying to level with them, but I'm being earnest. Sometimes I take poetry too seriously. I tell them about a poet I know who would write 15 minutes poems on her notes on her iPhone, and that I always envied that. Sometimes I take poetry too seriously. I tell them and I tell myself again. Today, we're going to be like O'Hara. We're going to write our poems quickly and let them be as they are. And maybe we're even going to have a Coke. And nobody laughs but me. Doubt grows on their faces. Eyebrows raise, lips curl. After 12 weeks, they know me better. Why was I sticking to rhymes and this as it should be? What was this nonsense of leaving the poem as is? I wait a few seconds and let them linger in the silence and discomfort until I say, or, and they exhale and feel relief. I tell them that when they're home, when they leave me, to revisit all of what we've written together. I offer this advice while I simultaneously distribute a worksheet on the Ghazal, which is a photocopy of the first pages of Wendy Bishop's Ghazal from, you can't really see it, but here's the title of the book, 13 Ways of Looking for a Poem. And I use the book so much that this is what it looks like. It has a definition of the Ghazal from the Poetry Foundation, and then my own paraphrasing of what I think the Ghazal and the form offers. My notes remind them that the form's not natural to English, but to Arabic. And so there's going to be some maneuvering that they have to do in order to make it feel natural to them. I mentioned that they might think about contemporary perceptions of love and mysticism if they want to stick to the traditional themes. But really what I tell them is what they already know. They've got the bare bones. Maybe some of their lines do not concern love. Maybe they're just downright silly. Come to think of it, maybe they've written anti-ghazals. But here we are this Wednesday afternoon, the Wednesday after Thanksgiving, building something together. I've given them the form. What they're working towards is the poem. And when class ends, when they leave me, when they go back to those lines, that's when they start to figure out the difference. Thank you, everybody.
Abriana, thank you for sharing. That was lovely. Next on our panel, we have Éireann Lorsung, who was selected by Garth Greenwell as the runner-up for the 2024 Bechtel Prize for her essay, "The Slowest Writing in the World. We Use a Needle and Thread to Learn to Write." Éireann works in a field of images, objects, movement, and texts. Her publications include Music for Landing Planes by, her book, and The Century, all available from Milkweed Editions. A 2016 NEA Fellow, she teaches at University College Dublin. In her essay, Éireann writes, "We have the sense that there is too much to do and never enough time for it. A thoughtfully crafted response to the demands of our fast-paced world, Éireann introduces a kinesthetic and multimedia approach to the creative writing classroom by swapping paper and pencil for needle and thread." Please join me in welcoming Éireann Lorsung as she shares an excerpt or shares from her essay.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here, especially a couple of people whose names I recognize, but really everybody. And thank you, Joshua, for the invitation. Thank you to Teachers and Writers for printing the essay, and to Garth Greenwell for reading it, and to Abriana and Reagan for your essays too. I'm going to share my screen. Voila. Okay. I thought I would just take a little bit of time to talk about what I do with my students, since the essay kind of exists in one form already for you, and you can hopefully find it if you want to online. I teach university students in and out of creative writing and English classrooms. One thing my students have repeatedly expressed to me is their own feelings of haste, pressure, anxiety, and detachment from the world around us. And I'll also note that this precedes 2020, but it has intensified since then. My students are very skilled at working quickly. Their economic and social surroundings have rewarded that and taught them that. They have real skill there. Given this, and in light of the feelings they express in our classroom, which is often the world, I want to give my students and me an experience of slow time and careful attention. And I want to remember with them how pleasurable this is. One way I try to make this possible for students is to use books that we bind in class, Slow Time, Connection to the World, to hold a series of repeated weekly exercises designed not to lead to a poem, but to teach us new possibilities for thinking, seeing, feeling, imagining, wondering. This commonplace book practice is a way for me and my students to experience and value non-end oriented writing. The exercises we do include drawing, walking, lying down, looking, listening, writing, and other things too. They generally take 3 to 5 minutes, and I ask students to do them 5 times a week. I also do them alongside the students. This past fall, I taught a class called Attention at my current institution. The class built on many of the commonplace book practices I've been doing with students since 2017, but extended some of them to take up a 2-hour class period. One exercise, a writing exercise, but also an exercise in hand-eye linking, in patience, in helping one another, in learning as we went, in allowing for unfinishedness, responded to our visit to the Textile Museum and our reading of Sarah Baum's book, Handiwork. The students brought embroidery floss and hoops. I brought needles, and linen. And at the start of class, we looked back on our visit to the Textile Museum, free wrote about what we knew attention to be, and studied embroidery diagrams. Then, all together, we sat down around our table and we began to embroider words or phrases from our free writing onto the linen. This was not an exercise in perfection, length, speed, or completeness. It was an exercise in being with one another and being with our materials in whatever way was possible for us that day. It was an exercise as much for later, days later, weeks later, probably years later, as for the moment. And when we hung our pieces, which all felt very incomplete to us, up in the hallway, we could see that what we had been doing, despite what felt like imperfections, slowness, incompleteness, or maybe because of these, was very much like what we want from any of our writing. It was beautiful. It was made of fragments over time, and it made sense together. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Éireann. Thanks for sharing, and thank you for the pictures. And next we have Reagan Ross, who was selected by Garth Greenwell as the honorable mention for the 2024 Bechtel Prize for their essay, Write Your Own Lord of the Flies with Dyslexia. Reagan is a writer and video essayist from Los Angeles, California. A Teach for America alum, they have worked in special education for 15 years. They are currently studying creative writing at UCLA and working on a YA novel. You can find their video essays on YouTube under Gnats Can Fly. In a wonderful balance of the personal and the pedagogical, Reagan's essay allows readers to become acquainted with their students, learn about dyslexia in the classroom, and teach The Lord of the Flies as a model text for students to explore the challenges of adolescence, home life, and the pandemic in their own writing. Please join me in welcoming Reagan Ross as they share an excerpt from their essay.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Joshua, and thank you, Garth and Éireann and Abriana for all your kind words. That was such a gorgeous presentation. Oh my goodness. And Abriana, the way you read that, your essay made me smile, and watching you read it made me really filled with joy. So thank you so much for sharing your gifts. I will read from the beginning of my essay, which you can also find online. I think the link is in the chat. And as a note, some names have been changed. So if you try to look up the school, you won't find it. But here we go. It's winter quarter at Rembrandt School for the Arts and Sciences, a learning academy for neurodivergent teenagers, and I am asking students to imagine eating their friends. As a learning specialist, I help high school students with social, emotional, and academic skills. I've known these particular students since 8th grade. We've gone through sex education, drugs and alcohol education, To Kill a Mockingbird, and the Civil War together. They're sophomores now and studying Lord of the Flies. Prompt is simple. Write your own version of Lord of the Flies. Use yourself and your classmates as characters. No word limit. You have 3 weeks. Just one problem. My students have dyslexia, and writing causes them tremendous anxiety. Some have been told by teachers that they can't read, let alone write original fiction. I know how hard reading is for my students because of Rembrandt's annual learning symposium. Each year, Rembrandt hosts a community education effort to teach neurotypical folks about neurodiversity. The symbols in this title are a combination of codes from a primer we use in a dyslexia simulator and Daniel Britton's dyslexia typographic design, which removes 40% of a Helvetica letter. And I want to shout out Joshua for making if you click on it, you see what looks like some gobbledygook after the title. I know that was kind of hard to get in the formatting, but I'm really grateful that was able to make it onto the webpage. People with dyslexia use complex decoding methods to aid their visual processing, which often leads to slower reading times compared with neurotypical students. Before widespread use of the clinical term, educators and psychologists often called dyslexia a reading disability. It absolutely crushes me when I hear kids say, "I can't read," words they no doubt heard from a parent, educator, adult, or peer who didn't understand their learning difference. Even though they can't read like a person without dyslexia, they absolutely can read. You can read, I tell them. We can't write though, they say. As my students crack jokes and tell stories in my classroom, I assure them that if they can tell a story, they can absolutely write one. Let's meet the class. We have Lana, a musical genius who spent whole months of 8th grade sitting under a desk because of shyness. We have Alex, who finds lots of way to humorize the fact that his dad left him and his mom. We have Jason, whose dad controls his every move. We have JC, who loves Grey's Anatomy and Dr. Pimple Popper and dreams of becoming a surgeon, but her dad thinks her dyslexia means she can't get into medical school. On top of their learning differences, these students also have to deal with teen horrors like puberty, eating disorders, cyberbullying, and depression. Luckily, none of them have ever seriously considered cannibalism.
Reagan, thank you. I love that closing line. It makes me chuckle every time. So to launch into our conversation, I want to ask a general question of each of you. And also before that, just a reminder to our audience that the Q&A feature is available. So please use that as questions come to you. But to start, I'd be curious to hear from each of you about the inspiration behind the lesson or projects in your essay. What kind of brought you to that place where you had these ideas to bring into the classroom, and how might they have yielded different results than other things that you have tried? So I'll open it up to whoever wants to begin.
Erin, would you like to take this question because you have so many supplies dealing with your lesson? I mean, I would love to hear. I'm really interested in how you do that, to be honest with you, if you don't mind leading.
Oh, that's such a teacher move. Well, thank you for that question, Joshua. As you were asking, I was thinking, well, where did that come from? Because I think in the essay I say, well, I kind of thought of it when I was rereading handiwork the summer before I was going to teach this class. But in fact, the first time I did this was like 10 years ago, with a group of adult students who were also creative writers, and who had come to a workshop that I was teaching about slowness, that was specifically pitched for adult writers who felt really pressed by the idea of success. You know, people maybe who had started later writing and felt like they had to catch up, or if people who felt really like the joy had gone out of just making work because they were really anxious about when would they get published. And when I started making that workshop, I was thinking about how do you physically slow it down? Because we're so fluent in language. We talk, most of us write, we look at the world all the time, taking in all kinds of visual and alphabetical data, and it feels like it's just naturally there. And so if it feels that way, how do we slow that down? And I thought, oh, well, we'll do something that will feel really non-fluent, but that will still feel pleasurable, and that will still yield something that is kind of very attractive. We'll use really nice materials for it. So we use really high quality linen, and we'll use really nice floss, and we'll take our time. So we will have 3 hours to do this, but maybe we'll only get 6 words, and that's totally okay. And so we can have this kind of experience of time that feels good rather than time that feels bad. Does that that's my answer. That's where it came from. I was thinking about how do we slow down.
That kind of leads into my question for Abriana, which is how did you come by the form of the gazelle?
Yeah, I knew we were going to be talking about this a little bit, so I don't want to come off and say that I'm a formalist in any way, but a lot of my education was profoundly influenced by formal poetry. And so I teach we offer one poetry class a year here at Kean University, and it's the one that I happen to teach. And I feel a profound responsibility to teach my students about form, and not so that they know form by the back of their hands, but so they can disrupt it and they know what types of histories they're speaking with. And so the weeks before, they had written already pantoums, sonnets, haikus, tangas, blackout poetry, list poems, free verse poems. And I find that the ghazal is one of the hardest ones. There's a lot of like, it could do this, it could do that. There's no hard and set rules, which makes it a little bit more complicated. And so I knew I wanted to save it for the end of the semester when they had already experimented with other forms. And I felt some pressure as the instructor in presenting it to them in a different way. There's only so many times you can give students and say, we're working on sonnets today, and then give them sonnets, and then read the sonnets, and then imitate the sonnets. And so I thought, what would it look like if they didn't know what they were working towards? And I tried to get that sort of allure in the paper where like, nobody knows what they're doing, and why are we doing this? There is also this idea that studying the history of traditional forms allows us to think about poetry in a global context. And I wanted them to be able to think about writing love poems in ancient Persia, and that we're kind of doing the same thing right now in 2023, New Jersey. So I guess the short and long answer is I'm not a formalist poet, but I love traditional formal poems, and I try to instill that value of loving form, whether they follow it or not, with my students.
Use the old sneak attack.
Yeah, and if I don't ever grade a student based off if they're following the form, right? But I think the form can lead us there, and I often don't grade students in general. I just comment on their work. Erin, I'm wondering though, was there any student, admittedly, I wasn't going to admit this, and then I feel like now I just have to. I've tried to knit. I can't even get the loop, right? Like, I'm so not a great person at that as much as I did. Did you have any difficulties with students feeling like how I think I might feel like I can't do this? I mean, even though I want to try this so badly, you've now inspired me to try again.
Yes, I think many of them felt that way. Yeah. But it turned out that they could do it. Everybody would, none of us are, I don't embroider in my spare time. I don't think several of my students had not ever threaded a needle. I would say the distinct minority had ever used an embroidery hoop. So none of this was familiar. But that was kind of how we went through the whole semester. We were every class doing things that were really unfamiliar to most of us in lots of different ways. And so at this point, this was quite late in the semester. So at this point, they were kind of used to that we were going to do things that were uncomfortable, that they were not going to be good at it, that was okay. That was pretty well ground in. But yeah, a number of them were really uncomfortable with it, but they did it. Yeah. They did it. Can I ask something? Or
Yeah,
Joshua, you were going to.
can I?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, can I pose a question for Reagan? That made me think of something I wanted to ask Reagan about, this idea of ability. So Reagan, in your essay, you talk about how, you're not just teaching creative writing, you're also teaching these kids who have this deep anxiety about their own abilities, that they are able to write a story, and that they do have that creative power. And so I'm just curious to give you a moment to talk about, why Lord of the Flies, like why this specific assignment, and where did your inspiration come for that?
Well, I guess now you're going to learn why I didn't jump to answer the last question. Why Lord of the Flies? Because it was part of the curriculum. And I'm sorry, I'm still learning how to use the Q&A. I saw someone asked if I'd read Damselfly. No, but that sounds like a must read. I'm excited to check that out. This prompt came from another teacher. Her name was Emily Ballier, and it was just what they did in the English department every year. But so I was a learning specialist, and I was really lucky because I had a really close relationship with this particular group of students because I was their learning specialist basically starting in 8th grade, and then I taught their PE class and their like, health class. So, and I knew their parents, and I'd kind of been working with them. Some people might not know what a learning specialist is, so I'll describe that briefly. At our school, the role of the learning specialist was like a sort of like a resource classroom where students would come for one. We had a block schedule, so you would have either like one of the blocks. So it wasn't every day. For some students, it was every day. If like for freshmen, we like to start them so they do have at least one block every day, and then as they become juniors and seniors, they only need one. And basically, what we do is we teach them how to accommodate their own learning differences. Um, and this one was really fun because all the students were in like the same block, and it was a small school, so they'd also grown up around each other and knew each other really well. And I always feel like you have to play on like the strengths of a group. For me, one of the most fun parts about teaching is like watching a group and seeing like what do they like, what do they already like doing? Because that's kind of your in. And these students really liked making each other laugh. So I kind of used that as a jumping off point for like, writing your own Lord of the Flies. And it also helped that we had read it together, and that it did kind of have like a pretty like healthy reaction to it because it's a really dark story. Um, sorry, can you restate your question? I'm afraid I've gotten too far from that.
Oh no, I feel like you're answering it perfectly. I was just kind of asking, the inspiration behind, and yeah, I guess I don't know if I directly asked, but maybe indirectly, this idea of, in addition to teaching creative writing, teaching students about like their ability and what they believe about themselves in the process of that.
Yes. Okay. So I do know totally how to answer that. At this school, it was really important on the very first day. We always did some sort of growth mindset activity. So for these students, we have the learning pit, which is it's a die, and they have to, make their own little learning pits and stick them in their binders. But it's basically, I'll try to do the shape with my hand. It's like you start here and then you fall off, and then you get in a hole, and then you have to get your resources. And then when you end, you have more knowledge. You're here, now you're here. So the idea is that the pit, it's okay to be in the pit. So that's kind of the first. I mean, for me, it's all about um, like mindsets. And the school was really incredible because they really emphasized a lot of social skills and social emotional learning. And I did feel like academics were important, but they definitely weren't every teacher's main focus. And when it was, that's when the students tended to freak out a little bit. But because I had them in a more supportive capacity, it's just giving yourself like space to fail, really. And normalizing that it's learning. Like you're in school to learn. Learning is hard and messy, and it is kind of hard when you see the people to whom it comes easily get like constantly rewarded. But we actually tried not to do that. We tried to reward, the process and the willingness to like get down and dirty in the pit. And I hear some educators, we also did a lot of team building and community building. I would do like a 10 to 15 minute activity. The blocks were long, they were like 80 minutes. But I hear sometimes other teachers say, like, I can't afford to do that stuff. And I'm like, you can't afford not to. Like you can't afford not to get students to connect with each other and believe in themselves. If you do that, your job is going to be so much easier. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That was really great. Éireann, I want to give space to the question that you were going to ask earlier, if you would still like to ask.
Well, it was also for Reagan, and it's maybe not as much of a question, but comes from reading your essay, but also hearing you talk a little bit. I can't remember exactly what you said at this point because I didn't make good enough notes. But it was a moment where you were talking about tempo. And I would love to hear you think aloud about ways that you or one or we normalize multiple tempos of reading and writing, because I feel like that's something, and it kind of goes to what you said as well, Abriana, about like, oh, were there students who were like, oh, I can't do this? Well, of course, everybody can use a needle. We definitely can. People have been doing it for like tens of thousands of years. Everybody can do this, but how do you normalize that difference in tempo? It's okay. You can be a person with this tempo and you can be a person with this tempo, but how do we normalize that in a space like the classroom where it's so often prioritized to be a fast tempo person?
When you say tempo, do you mean the time it takes a student to complete a task?
Maybe, yeah, that could be part of it, or also like how quickly you respond or how quickly you do work. Yeah, any of that stuff. Or how
Yeah,
slowly you do those things.
that's a really good question. There were definitely a variety of ways that we um like accommodated for that. One of the things that one of the skills we teach is time management. So in having like, okay, you have 3 weeks, it's like, some students are going to need to spend a lot of time on the pre-writing process. The two main things that come to mind is I did put students on timers where it was like the goal is just to write as much as you can in, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, write for the whole time. That when you first start doing that, it's really hard. And especially if I mean, some of these students were like had journals and they were writers and it was easier for them. But like the thing of like getting your thoughts out of your brain is a really hard thing to start to get to do. And then I think there's also like I've also been asked about like assistive technologies and stuff. Um, and so speaking, that's in the essay too. If you liked the essay, go to Teachers and Writers and read it. But the thing of like speaking of like going outside and like just making a notes app, or like I would sometimes accept that as like a pre-write, because all kinds of minds, right? People learn and create all kinds of ways. So that's one way. The other thing, because it's like the constant struggle in the classroom, like what if I finish first? We would have like a passion project that you would work on when you were done with your, main work. And also, since the classes were small enough, we could also check the work. So it would be like, okay, you did this, bring it to me. I'll go through it. I'll be like, yeah, you did this. You can go work on your passion project. Or I'd be like, well, this is, this is what the directions say. This is what you did. These are the things you need to change, and then give it back to them. So it kind of felt like the time, it was always like a revolving like productivity. Like everyone wasn't always doing the same thing in the classroom. Um, does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
super lovely.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there's lots of ways to do it, but it's challenging. That's a great question. Thank you.
I have a question that I originally intended for Éireann, but I'm thinking it works with Abriana's essay as well. So Éireann, toward the end of your essay, you write about the feeling of doing something that is at once correct and out of order. And I really liked that idea. So your students have this feeling of out of orderness, ironing their embroidery in English class because it's just so unexpected. But then they also acknowledge that, yes, they're doing literature, which is correct, in the classroom. And you also talk about embodiment too throughout. And I'm curious how this idea of surprise, of the unexpected, might help students be more embodied through a lesson and be more embodied through the process. And Abriana, I think this goes with your essay as well in a kind of different way because you know, your essay has this really mischievous tone, which I love, where you know what's happening, but the students don't know what's happening, and they're writing us all, but they don't know it, but you know it, and then you reveal it to them at the end. So I guess I'm curious to hear from both of you, and Reagan also, if you have any thoughts about the role of surprise in a lesson and how that might aid engagement as well as like this kind of personal embodiment or awareness throughout that process.
Abriana, why don't you go ahead?
I just knew you were going to do that, Erin. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just, I think I'll answer this in sort of two ways. One, it's just sort of like been drilled in my head all the time. There's no surprise for you, the writer. There's no surprise for you, the reader. And so I very rarely, unless it's like an academic piece and this research thing that I'm working on where I know I really want to hit this particular goal, I very rarely write with the intention of making sure I say a certain thing. So there's always that element of surprise. But I think one of the best ways to answer it is to think about a quote that I saw in Erin's presentation. And someone wrote, "Attention is a multi-directional poet." And it's just that idea that, if you're paying attention, you're going to be surprised. I don't know if that was you, Erin, who wrote it or one of your students, but it was just this beautiful thing and I had to copy it down. I think that's how I'll answer it, by using Erin's words from that. And I also just want to pause and say that I think that your Reagan and Erin's essays, almost like what you're doing with your students, Erin, with the embroidery, is what Reagan, you're doing with your students, but it's made tangible, right? They could just see it in this more clear way, that slow process, using all these different tools to get to the word or the story that they really want to share in this sort of visual learning way. So I think they complement each other so nicely. And it's natural for it to lead into the conversation because it's almost like two essays that made a baby together in this beautiful way. So anyway, that's how I'll answer it, Josh.
I think all our forms are forms for invention, and that includes the classroom. And I think that it is very easy to go into any form that I recognize and say, I already know you. I don't have to pay attention to you. Nothing new is going to happen here. And I think when something hits me in that form, that I remember I have a body and that I remember I can move. I think surprise gets us out of our priors. I think those priors include our priors about ourselves, what we can and can't do, what is and isn't for us, where we can and can't go, what can and can't happen in our presence. I think those priors include what art can be. I think those priors include what teaching looks like. And so I feel like my entire pedagogy is basically trying to say, how else can we see what we're going to do together so that we can take all of the stuff we know about the way things have been and make whatever needs to be that comes right from who we are, when we are, where we are, with the people we're with, responsive to the histories we come from, and yet not merely repeating those forms. That for me is what surprise can do. Get us out of our priors, minute by minute.
Thank you. That was great. Any more questions? Do any of you have questions for each other?
I guess, Erin, my question for you, that you've already sort of answered it, but at the beginning of your essay, you mentioned, you have a line about how reading seemed so much nicer when you were in childhood because it didn't seem like there was so much of a the pace. You just had more time. I was gonna try and pull it up and read the exact quote, but I know where I want to make time. Be mindful of time. How do you feel things? Do you feel that your students will look back on their childhoods that same way, or do you feel that we are more aligned? Do you feel like we're all in this hustle together more than when you were growing up?
So actually, that was me quoting a student. That's a student saying that, oh, I remember being able to read as a child. So that was actually a student in my attention class saying to me, this is the first time I've read a book as engrossed as I remember having been able to be as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old. So for them, you know, that wasn't a huge gap. That was maybe 8 years gap, but still it was really remarkable to me that they could remember having had a different quality to their attention that they now did not. And I've had other students say that as well. Like, I can remember having been really a reader and now I'm not a reader. And those are uniformly, you know, students who are between 19 and 23. So they're really not far removed from childhood. Yeah, so I mean, I think we're all well, I don't know. I think everybody who uses screen-based technologies and social media has experienced a different relationship with time than people who do not use screen-based technologies and social media. I think that that's true. But of
Wow.
course, my experience is different from my students because my experience of that time without that was longer. I don't know.
It's really interesting. Thanks.
I think this is really interesting, Reagan, in connection to the work that you do with your students, which, you know, I've heard over the past few years a lot of English professors saying like, oh, we're going to go do away with all technology in the classroom. I even know some people who will say like, no laptops whatsoever, right? And I'm like, oh no, like, how would I write? And so I'm wondering if you might be able to share some insights about the way that technology has really helped your students share the magic that's already in them, but in a way that's more accessible for them to do without the anxieties of trying to fit in the typical way of writing, I suppose.
Totally. Well, I think the best technology in a writing classroom for a student is the one they will use. There are a lot of amazing assistive technologies out there. For example, you know, I have been out of the classroom for a couple of years, but when I left, there were already apps that would read to you, you know, in like a robot voice. They didn't like that. I mean, even if there was an audiobook, they would do that if in a crunch, but they really wanted me to read to them as often as possible. So I think it's important to have the options, you know, so that and then when we went virtual and, you know, they had to be more self-sufficient, they would choose more of the options available. The assistive technologies that I found were used the most were Google text to type, which if you enable dictation on a Google Doc, you can just speak into your computer or your phone and it will it'll write it for you. If you do that, you do have to use a spell checker. There was another English professor at my school who made everybody get Grammarly, the Grammarly extension. And if they didn't check it, run it through Grammarly, she'd be like, I'm not going to look at it, take it back. Especially because, you know, if you have a reading learning difference, it's really hard for you to catch, you know, visually things that are going on. So I did think Grammarly was a huge boon for those students. Text to type. I am going to get kind of up on my soapbox and say, I don't think LLMs have a place in a writing classroom because they remove like writing is a creative process. LLMs remove the creative process in pursuit of a product. If the product is a piece of writing and you didn't create it, you used an LLM, which I call like ChatGPT or stuff like that. I call those large language models and not AI, because I think the AI, like that, I'm not going to, you know, get into that here. I think people misuse that term a lot. But like LLMs, they're basically language calculators. So they're good for the pre-writing process. And I think if you're someone who's like, you know, maybe an engineering student and you have to take a writing class for college and you're not going to be a writer and everybody knows that, fine. But if you're teaching writing, that's kind of where I draw the line as far as like you didn't write it. So luckily I didn't deal with a whole ton of that. Also, they're usually not very good. Sometimes the students would like try it out and then be like, oh, listen to this, like listen to this thing this wrote, and then it would just be like pretty much gobbledygook. And I could always usually tell when something like that was used. But everything up to that point, I think, go for it.
We have a few questions from the audience, and I just want to be sure that we try to address some of those. The first one from Tina, I think, is directed toward you, Reagan. How have you changed as you helped your students change their minds about poetry and their ability to write and pay attention? P.S. My mom got her social work degree in the 70s from Keene and loved it. I teach in LA.
I
Or
think that
is
might
that
be for
where
Abriana.
maybe that's Abriana? Yeah, apologies. You live in LA, Reagan, which is why I think I made that connection.
That's true.
Oh,
Sorry, I was muted. Awesome for your mom. I love that. Go King. Thank you, Tina, for your question. My students change me every semester. And I'm really, that's the whole point of it, I think, is that they, there's each year, there's some grumbles about like what the youth is, but I never see that with my students. And it might be because they're humanists and they come into the classroom willing to write poetry and learn. But a lot of the anti-work that I do is like, okay, like, don't worry about if you do the form, do an anti-form or anti-title, or that's all because of my students, because they're just so fed up with the rules and the traditions, and they're creating their own new rules. And they've really inspired me to do that. Certainly my traditional, some of my traditional professors would be like, that's definitely not a sonnet. And I'd be like, well, okay. And I think I've been lucky to have a little bit of both in my education that assures me everything's okay if you break a rule or two. So the students today, they're multimodal in so many ways. They're creating fun things with language all the time. And they're just, yeah, that's the whole point. And some of them don't like formal poetry and history, and that changes my mind too, because I love it so much. And then they say, well, no, it's not really for us. Probably the most intriguing conversation I've had was about Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina, and she broke some rules. Why did she break those rules? That's not okay. Yes, it is, or no, it's not. So I know we have crunch with time, so that's all I'll say is they always change me and surprise me.
Just want to share that Tina opened that question to everyone. If Éireann or Reagan, you have a response. But I would also like to open Tina's question in conjunction with an anonymous question that says, what is the most important understanding students gain by being able to recognize and even write within poetic forms and structures? So feel free to answer either of those, anybody.
I'm gonna leave that to the poets.
Okay. I would love to speak to this anonymous question. Thank you. It's a really beautiful question. I too like the forms of the received tradition in which I was educated. And I too realize that that tradition may not be everybody's, which is totally fine. I think the thing that learning to recognize received form gives us, if we have good teachers or patience with ourselves, is the ability to recognize later, once we get out of the classroom and stop thinking, oh my God, I have to write 14 lines. They have to have this rhyme pattern. They have to have this stress pattern. I have a stress pattern. Once we get out of the classroom and we have that thing called form jangling around in our being, then in the best case scenario, I think it teaches us to recognize that everything in the world has form. Everything has form. And that therefore our literature can learn its form from the things of the world. That the received forms of our poetic tradition are just a few more things with form that we learn to make poems from, but that likewise a window has a form, and a house has a form, and a gallery has a form, and a map of streets has a form, and a clump of wildflowers has a form, and that those two are things that are literary making can learn to make itself from. So metonymous, not absolute strictures.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Erin. If I could just add, it feels good to say, to name something and say you made it, and to claim it as that thing, whether it follows exactly the rules or not. Like, I made a sonnet this week. I wrote a ghazal this week. I wrote a free verse poem this week. It's nice to be able to claim things. And there, there's that saying, name it to claim it to tame it, right? So I would just add that.
Beautiful answers. Thank you. I'd like to close with one more question from the audience. An anonymous attendee asked, I'm a relatively new creative writing instructor. How do you come up with your ideas? So if you could share for new teachers, who are trying to develop new ideas, how do you find yours?
I will share because Éireann and Abriana, you two are visionaries. When I started teaching, they that it's beautiful that you want to do that, and if you have one, you should use it, but lean on those that came before. There's so many incredible teachers who have made, curriculums or have blogs or have their materials. Like, I don't know if people still use teachers pay teachers. I used a little bit of that when I was doing elementary school. But I actually really loved Pinterest too. I would find like these writing prompts. Oh man, I wish I could have pulled them up. It was like you come home and you find out someone's stolen your couch. What do you do? Right? And I also have like a screenwriting background. So a lot of the best things that have gotten me to write when I'm learning about that is like solving a problem, like every kind of like in screenwriting, we have the central dramatic issue. If you can kind of get students to think about something they want, a question they want answered, or a problem they want to solve, that's, I think, when the real creative thinking comes in. So I would say don't pressure yourself to, reinvent the wheel, and also like just pay attention to what they like. Like that's that's always my best advice is, what do they like? What do they already like? What TV shows are they watching? Also fan fiction. Like so many of my students started writing through fan fiction and it was amazing.
The more that you teach, the better you become at it, I think. I think if I was a new teacher in my first or second year, I would feel a little hesitant about doing a backwards lesson. Am I allowed to do that? What if somebody comes in and sees me, blah, blah, blah. But the more I taught, the more I felt more in control of my classroom, more power of my classroom, and more insistence on doing exactly what Reagan just said, which is like getting to know my students. And I knew that they would trust me and guiding them. So yeah, just I would say, even though probably it's the worst advice, is like, don't be afraid to be in control of your own lessons and do what you would want to do in the classroom. Because probably somebody else would want to do that as well.
I will echo Reagan first. There's a lot to borrow, including from the library, lots of books. And I've found like older books can be really interesting because they do things that are completely out of style, and that makes them exciting. I'm always having to remember that the ideas aren't in me, they are all in the poems. And so going to class ready to just read a poem together, if I go back to that poem, often an idea will come to me from the poem itself, from the reading itself. What are we going to do today? What can this give us? How can this teach us whatever it is that we're kind of interested in, whether it's image or movement or whatever. I also think the question, what is the aim of this, is a really important question when I'm trying to figure out how to teach. Like, okay, I want to do this thing. Oh, I think it'd be cool to embroider stuff with my students. I'm kind of into that right now. Okay, what is the aim of this? And then if I can think what the aim is, then I can figure out how to scaffold the thing I want to do so the students will, I hope, move toward the thing I want them to learn. And then finally the questions, what else and how else could I do this? What else could I do? How else could I do this? Are useful for me.
Wonderful. Wow. This has been such a pleasure for me, especially having spent time with each of your essays to hear from you face to face. Thank you, Abriana, Éireann, and Reagan, for carving out the time to share with us today. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in. This talk will be available later on the magazine if you would like to revisit. And also, if anybody is interested in learning more about the Bechtel Prize, I've shared a link in the chat. We will open submissions for the 2025 Bechtel Prize beginning October 1st, if I am remembering correctly. So start thinking of those ideas that you would like to share. And yeah, thank you very much to everybody for tuning in. Be well.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for everything. Bye, everybody.
Yeah,
It was
thank
so
you.
lovely to hear you.
Thanks for sticking around and letting it was so fun to pick your beautiful brains, and thanks for all your thoughtful questions, and thanks again, Joshua, for coordinating. This is great.
Thank you all. Thanks, Joshua.